Chapter 7. Drought and Revelation. March arrived without the customary thaw, the winter's meager snowfall having done little to replenish the land. By mid-April, when gentle rains should have been greening the Wyoming prairie, the skies remained a harsh, unrelenting blue. Each morning I searched the horizon for clouds, only to be met with the same vast emptiness stretching from mountain to plain. "No use staring at it," Harold remarked one morning as he pulled on his boots by the kitchen door. "Sky's as dry as an old bone." I turned from the window, the breakfast dishes balanced in my hands. "The widow Parker told me yesterday this is the driest spring she's seen in 30 years. Harold grunted, reaching for his hat. "Old woman's probably losing her memory along with her teeth." I bit my tongue against a sharp retort. In the 6 weeks since I'd moved to the Miller farm, I'd learned that Harold had little patience for opinions that contradicted his own, particularly those offered by women. It was yet another discovery about the man I'd agreed to marry, a man who, I was coming to realize, bore little resemblance to the considerate gentleman described in those long-ago letters. "Will you be checking the Southfield today?" I asked, setting the dishes in the wash basin. "What for? Nothing sprouting." He yanked his suspenders over his shoulders with unnecessary force. "Waste of good seed, that's what it is. If this keeps up much longer, we'll be lucky to harvest enough to feed ourselves, let alone sell in Riverton." As if sensing the tension, Thomas began to fuss in his cradle by the stove. I wiped my hands on my apron and lifted him, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair. At 3 months old, he'd finally begun to overcome his colicky nature, though he still slept fitfully most nights. "Perhaps you might repair the windmill for the well," I suggested, patting Thomas's back soothingly. "Mrs. Wilson mentioned at church that several families in town are struggling to water their gardens now that Timber Creek has slowed." Harold's expression darkened. "What do I care about town gardens? I've got 100 acres to worry about." "I only thought, well, duh." He cut me off with a dismissive wave. "Women don't understand farming or business. You concern yourself with the house and the baby and leave men's work to men." The harshness of his tone startled Thomas into a full cry. As I bounced the infant and murmured comfort, Harold grabbed his jacket from its hook and strode toward the door. "I'll be checking the lower pasture," he announced over the baby's wails. "Don't hold supper if I'm late." The door slammed behind him with such force that a thin film of dust drifted down from the ceiling beams. I pressed my cheek against Thomas's downy head, rocking him gently as I stared at the closed door. In the early days at the Miller farm, I'd attributed Harold's occasional brusqueness to worry over his son and the strain of recent widowhood. I'd told myself that patience and understanding would eventually restore the thoughtful man whose letters had once given me such hope for the future. But as the weeks passed and the drought tightened its grip on Timber Creek, Harold's mask of civility had begun to slip with alarming frequency. Each rainless day revealed more of his true nature, the impatience, the dismissiveness, the streak of selfishness that seemed to widen with each crop report. "There now," I whispered to Thomas as his cries subsided. "Your father's just worried about the farm. Men get cross when their livelihoods are threatened." But even as I made excuses aloud, my heart knew better. I thought of Caleb Morgan, whose livelihood as the town blacksmith was equally threatened by the drought. Farmers with failing crops had little money for new implements or repairs. Yet during my weekly visits to teach the children, I'd never once heard him speak with the cutting edge that had become Harold's habitual tone. I carried Thomas to the front porch, settling into the rocking chair with my mending basket. From this vantage point, I could see clear to Timber Creek, now reduced to a pitiful ribbon winding through town. The cottonwoods along its banks had leafed out, but their foliage seemed thin and yellowed, despite the early season. In the distance, a plume of dust marked Harold's progress toward the lower pasture, where our small herd of cattle grazed on increasingly sparse vegetation. Beyond, barely visible on the horizon, rose the smoke from the smithy's chimney. My eyes lingered there, mind drifting to the 5 faces that had come to mean so much to me, faces that brightened each Tuesday when I arrived for their lessons. The contrast between those afternoons at the Morgan home and my days at the Miller farm grew starker with each passing week. There, despite the modest surroundings and the strain of drought, I found laughter, purpose, and warmth. Here, in this grand house with its polished floors and fashionable furnishings, I felt increasingly like a stranger. My gaze drifted to my bare left hand, needle flashing in the sunlight as I mended one of Harold's shirts. The wedding, originally planned for early March, had been postponed until conditions improved. I'd expressed appropriate disappointment, while secretly feeling relief. Each delay gave me more time to reconcile myself to a future that seemed less appealing with each unveiling of Harold's character. A hot, dry breeze stirred the dust at the edge of the porch, sending a tumbleweed bouncing across the yard. In my arms, Thomas dozed peacefully, untroubled by drought or disappointment. I envied him his innocent slumber, free from the growing knowledge that I'd exchanged one mistake for another, possibly worse one. By late afternoon, Harold returned in a fouler mood than when he departed. He flung his hat onto the sideboard and dropped heavily into his chair at the supper table. "Cattle are looking poorly," he announced without greeting, "and the creek's down another 2 inches since yesterday." I set a plate of cornbread beside the stew I'd managed to prepare despite our dwindling pantry. "Did you see anyone from town on your rounds? I wonder how others are faring." "Who cares how they're faring?" Harold stabbed his spoon into the stew. "Every man has his own troubles in times like these." "Surely we're stronger together than apart," I ventured, thinking of the sense of community I'd witnessed in Timber Creek during my months there. "The Morgan children told me Mr. Peterson is organizing a town meeting to discuss water conservation." Harold's spoon clattered against his plate. "Waste of time, talk won't bring rain." "Perhaps not, but sharing resources might help everyone survive until it comes." His eyes narrowed. "What resources?" "My well is on my property, dug with my money." I know what you meant." He pushed back from the table, his meal half finished. "You've been spending too much time with those Morgan brats, getting ideas above your station." Heat rushed to my cheeks. "The children are well-mannered and bright. There's nothing improper about teaching them." "No?" Harold leaned forward, his face flushed with more than the evening heat. "Then why does the whole town whisper about how you light up during those visits? How that blacksmith watches you when he thinks no one's looking?" My breath caught. "That's absurd. Mr. Morgan respects my position as Thomas's future mother. Nothing more." "Is that so?" Harold's voice dropped dangerously. "Then you won't mind skipping tomorrow's lesson. I need you here to help me repair the chicken coop." I thought of the children waiting eagerly for my arrival, of Sarah's progress with her letters, of the history examination I'd promised Samuel. "I've given my word," I said steadily. "I won't disappoint them." For a moment, I thought he might forbid me outright. His jaw worked silently, a vein throbbing at his temple. Then with visible effort, he controlled himself. "Fine," he said coldly, "but remember who provides your home, Elizabeth. Remember your place." As he stalked from the room, I remained at the table, hands trembling in my lap. In that moment, with startling clarity, I understood what I'd been reluctant to admit for weeks. The man I'd agreed to marry was not the man I'd imagined him to be in those hopeful days before arriving in Timber Creek. More troubling still was the realization that my heart no longer resided in this grand but empty house, but in a modest home at the edge of town, with a family that had claimed it without my notice or permission. The town meeting was held the following evening in the church, the only building in Timber Creek large enough to accommodate nearly every adult resident. I arrived with Harold just as Pastor Walsh was arranging chairs in the center of the sanctuary, the pews having been pushed back against the walls to create an open meeting space. "Might as well have held this in the saloon," Harold muttered as we entered. "Least then a man could get a proper drink for his trouble." I ignored the comment, scanning the gathering crowd for familiar faces. Mrs. Wilson waved from near the altar, where she sat with several other town matrons. Fred Peterson, who owned the general store alongside his wife, stood at the front with the mayor and several men I recognized as the town council. And there, near the side door, stood Caleb Morgan, deep in conversation with the livery owner. He wore his good shirt, the one reserved for Sundays, and had attempted to tame his unruly hair with water. Even from across the room, I could see the fatigue etched in his features, the strain of recent weeks visible in the set of his shoulders. As though sensing my gaze, he looked up, our eyes meeting across the crowded room. Something passed between us, a current of understanding, perhaps, or shared concern. Before Harold's hand at my elbow guided me firmly toward seats near the back. "Evening, Miller, Miss Foster," Pastor Walsh greeted us, wiping perspiration from his brow despite the open windows. "Glad you could join us." Harold merely nodded curtly, but I offered a smile. "Thank you for organizing this, Pastor. I hope we might find solutions together." "From your lips to God's ears, my dear," the pastor replied. "Though the good Lord helps those who help themselves, as they say." People continued to file in, the room growing uncomfortably warm with so many bodies pressed together in the April heat. I spotted the Morgan children seated with Mrs. Wilson, Samuel keeping watchful eye on his siblings. My heart lightened at the sight of them, even as I wondered at their presence at such an adult gathering. Mayor Chambers called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of his walking stick against the floor. The murmurs gradually subsided as he stepped to the front of the room. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice carrying easily through the church. "I won't waste words. We face the worst drought in memory, and Timber Creek is living up to its name, more timber than creek, these days." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd. "Mr. Peterson has some figures on rainfall that paint a grim picture." "Fred?" The storekeeper stepped forward, unfolding a sheet of paper. "Been keeping records these past 12 years," he explained. "Normal spring sees about 4 inches of rain by end of April. This year we've had less than half an inch." Worried murmurs swept the room. Beside me, Harold shifted impatiently. "Wells are already running low," the mayor continued. "The creek's barely flowing. We need to discuss how to manage what water remains until the rains come." "If they come," someone called from the back. "They'll come," Pastor Walsh interjected firmly. "We must have faith while taking prudent action." "What action?" Harold's voice rose above the others. "Each man must look to his own holdings. My great-grandfather didn't cross the plains and fight Indians to have his grandson share what's rightfully his." Several heads nodded in agreement, particularly among the larger landowners seated near us. My cheeks burned at Harold's callous words, so at odds with the community spirit I'd witnessed during my time in Timber Creek. "That's one view," Mayor Chambers acknowledged diplomatically. "But I'd like to hear others before we decide a course." Mrs. Wilson raised her hand. "The general store has the largest well in town. Fred and I are willing to allow households without wells to draw water for cooking and washing, within reason, of course." Murmurs of appreciation followed her offer. I glanced at Harold, hoping to see his expression soften at this example of generosity, but his features remained set in stubborn lines. "The livery will do the same," called Mr. Donovan from near the side door. "Got a good deep well that's holding steady so far." "That's 2, the mayor noted. "Anyone else?" A tense silence fell. I knew many in the room were reluctant to commit their precious water reserves without knowing how long the drought might last. Self-preservation warred with neighborly concern on many faces. "Mr. Morgan," Mrs. Wilson prompted. "What about the Smithy well?" All eyes turned to Caleb, who straightened from his position against the wall. "My well's at everyone's disposal," he said simply. "Not particularly deep, but it's never run dry, even in the 67 drought." I felt a surge of pride at his unhesitating generosity, followed by shame at Harold's earlier selfishness. The contrast between the 2 men couldn't have been starker, one offering freely what little he had, the other hoarding abundance behind walls of privilege. "That's something," Mayor Chambers acknowledged, "but we need more than just access to wells. We need a system, a way to ensure everyone gets what they need without waste." The discussion continued, various proposals raised and debated. Some suggested water rationing based on household size. Others advocated priority for families with livestock over those with merely vegetable gardens. Throughout, Harold's impatience grew palpably beside me, his boot tapping an irritated rhythm against the wooden floor. "Excuse me," I said finally, raising my hand. The mayor nodded, granting me the floor. I stood, conscious of all eyes upon me, In Boston, during a particularly dry summer, my father's neighborhood created a cooperative system for sharing well water. "Boston ain't Wyoming territory, Miss Foster," someone called, generating scattered laughter. I smiled, acknowledging the truth in the statement. No, but thirst is the same everywhere. The system was simple. Those with wells created a schedule, allowing families without water to come at designated times. In return, those families contributed labor or goods to the well owners. Interest rippled through the room. I continued, gaining confidence as I outlined the details. For instance, a family might draw water on Tuesday afternoons, and in exchange, the children might help with the well owner's garden or mending. Everyone contributed according to ability. Everyone received according to need. "Sounds like charity," Harold interjected loudly from beside me. "Or worse, socialism." "Not charity," I corrected firmly. "Fair exchange. No one gives something for nothing, but everyone survives." "Makes sense to me," Mrs. Wilson declared. "We could draw up a schedule tonight. Start tomorrow." Several voices rose in agreement. I looked around the room, heartened by the nodding heads and thoughtful expressions. My gaze met Caleb's across the space, and the quiet approval in his eyes warmed me more than I cared to admit. "This is absurd," Harold stood abruptly. "Every man has the right to dispose of his property as he sees fit. My well serves my land and my household. I won't have strangers tramping across my fields using water I paid to have dug." A shocked silence followed his declaration. I remained standing, mortification washing over me in waves. To be publicly opposed by the man I was to marry, to have him dismiss a suggestion meant to help the entire community, the humiliation was nearly unbearable. "No one's asking you to give away your livelihood, Miller." Caleb's calm voice broke the uncomfortable silence. "Just to share what you can spare with neighbors in need." Harold's face flushed dark. "Easy for you to say, Morgan. You've got no crops to water, no stock to maintain, just a bunch of horseshoes and some orphaned brats." Gasps rippled through the assembly. I sank back into my chair, wishing the floor might open and swallow me whole. To speak so cruelly of children, of Caleb's children, revealed a meanness of spirit I could no longer pretend not to see. "Those orphaned brats, as you call them, have more human decency in their little fingers than you've demonstrated in your entire speech," Mrs. Wilson declared, rising to her feet. "And they're not orphans. They have a fine father who'd give his last drop of water to help a neighbor in need." Murmurs of agreement followed her statement. Harold looked around, perhaps only now realizing how his words had landed among the townspeople who valued community above individual gain. "You all do as you please," he said finally, reaching for his hat. "But don't come crying to Harold Miller when your charity leaves your own families thirsty." He turned to me, voice dropping to a command. "We're leaving." I hesitated, torn between proper obedience to my betrothed and the shame his behavior had stirred within me. Across the room, 5 pairs of eyes watched with varying degrees of concern and hope. The Morgan children, who'd witnessed the entire exchange, and now looked to me with expressions that tore at my heart. "I'd like to stay," I said quietly, "to help organize the schedule." Harold's expression hardened. "I won't ask twice, Elizabeth." The implicit threat in his tone, the suggestion of consequences should I disobey, sent a chill through me, despite the stuffy warmth of the church. I glanced once more at the Morgan children, at Caleb's carefully neutral expression, before gathering my reticule. "I apologize," I murmured to those nearby as I followed Harold from the church. The walk home stretched in brittle silence, Harold striding several paces ahead while I followed, humiliation burning in my throat like bile. The contrast between his selfishness and the generous spirit I'd witnessed in others, in Caleb, couldn't have been starker. By the time we reached the farmhouse, the knowledge I'd been eating for weeks crystallized into certainty. I could not marry Harold Miller, not merely because I loved another, though I did, God help me, but because I could not bind myself to a man whose character stood so opposed to everything I valued. The question that remained as I climbed the stairs to check on Thomas was how to extricate myself from a commitment made before witnesses, in a community where a woman's options were circumscribed by propriety and necessity. And what would become of the sweet infant who had claimed my heart despite his father's failings? 3 nights after the town meeting, a suffocating heat descended upon Timber Creek. Even with every window thrown wide, the farmhouse retained the day's warmth like a brick oven. I tossed restlessly atop my bed covers, nightgown clinging to my damp skin, hair plastered to my neck in damp tendrils. Just past midnight, Thomas finally succumbed to an exhausted sleep, his small face flushed with heat, despite the cool cloth I'd laid across his forehead. I envied him, his innocent slumber, free from the worries that kept my own eyes resolutely open. Since the meeting, Harold had maintained a cold politeness that was somehow worse than outright anger. He spoke only when necessary, his responses clipped and formal, as though addressing a stranger rather than his betrothed. The tension had become a living thing between us, growing with each passing day. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, followed by the soft tread of footsteps on the stairs. I sat up, straining to hear through the oppressive stillness. The front door opened and closed with a gentle click. Curious, I slipped from bed and moved to the window. In the silver wash of moonlight, I could make out Harold's figure crossing the yard, a lantern swinging from one hand, a burlap sack in the other. He headed not toward the barn or outbuildings, but down the sloping meadow that led to Timber Creek, where it crossed the southern edge of his property. Something about his furtive manner raised the hairs on my arms. I glanced at Thomas, confirming he slept soundly, then hastily pulled a shirtwaist over my nightgown and stepped into my worn house slippers. After tucking a light blanket around the baby's crib and placing a chair so he couldn't roll to the floor should he wake, I slipped downstairs and out into the night. The full moon illuminated the landscape in ghostly relief, casting long shadows from the cottonwoods that lined the property. Crickets sang in the dry grass, and somewhere an owl called, lonely and distant. I followed Harold's retreating lantern light, staying well back, guided by instinct more than thought. The meadow grass whispered against my skirts as I picked my way carefully down the slope. The creek came into view, little more than a pathetic trickle between cracked mud banks where water had flowed freely just months before. Harold had stopped at the bend where the waterway curved into Miller property from the Peterson place upstream. I crouched behind a gnarled cottonwood, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. Harold set down his lantern and crouched at the creek's edge, removing tools from the burlap sack, a mallet, wood planks, what appeared to be heavy canvas. Working with purpose, he began reinforcing what I now saw was a crude dam spanning the narrow creek. My breath caught as understanding dawned. The structure was positioned precisely to divert what little water remained from its natural course through town, instead channeling it into the irrigation ditch that serviced the Miller fields. For several minutes, I watched in disbelief as Harold methodically sealed gaps in his handiwork, checking the water's new path with evident satisfaction. When he finally stood, wiping his brow with a bandana, I stepped from my hiding place, unable to contain my outrage a moment longer. "So this is why the creek has nearly dried up in town," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the night air. Harold spun toward me, lantern light casting distorted shadows across his startled face. "Elizabeth, what are you doing out here?" "I might ask you the same question." I moved closer, gesturing to the dam, though I believe I'm of my answer. He straightened, initial surprise hardening into defiance. "Go back to the house. This doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me?" Indignation lent strength to my voice. "The entire town is suffering from water shortage. Children are thirsty, gardens are dying, livestock growing gaunt, and you've deliberately made it worse." "I've protected what's mine," he countered, jaw set stubbornly. "This water flows through my property. I have every right to use it." "The water belongs to everyone downstream as well," I argued, recalling discussions from the town meeting. "You can divert some for your needs, but not the entire creek." Harold snorted dismissively. "Says who? There's no law against it. There are laws of decency, of community." I gestured toward town. "People trusted you. They believed everyone was suffering equally under the drought. And we are. I'm just being smarter about it. He began gathering his tools, clearly considering the discussion finished. The dam stays, Elizabeth, and you'll keep quiet about it if you know what's good for you. The implied threat sent a chill through me, despite the warm night. Or what? What will you do if I speak the truth? Harold straightened, his expression hardening in the lantern light. For the first time, I saw something truly ugly beneath the handsome features that had once seemed so promising in daguerreotypes sent with his letters. You're to be my wife, he said coldly. Your loyalty belongs to me, not to Morgan or his brood or anyone else in that backward little town. My loyalty belongs to what's right, I replied, voice steady despite my racing heart. And this isn't right, Harold. You know it isn't. What I know, he said, stepping closer, is that I've worked too hard to build this farm, to watch it wither, because some shopkeepers and that blacksmith can't dig proper wells. My father didn't die clearing this land for me to share what's rightfully mine. In that moment, with moonlight silvering his angry features, I saw Harold Miller with perfect clarity, a man whose sense of entitlement outweighed any consideration for his neighbor's suffering. A man who could watch children go thirsty while his fields drank their fill and feel justified in his actions. I can't marry you, the words slipped out, soft but certain, carrying the weight of immutable truth. Harold stilled. What did you say? I said I can't marry you. My voice gained strength with each word. Not now, not ever. I could perhaps forgive your treatment of me, but I cannot join my life to a man who would behave with such callous disregard for others. A muscle worked in his jaw. You'd break our engagement over this? A simple water diversion any sensible farmer would implement? This is merely the final revelation of your character, I replied, surprised by my own calmness. You've shown me who you truly are, Harold. Not in your letters, not in your courtship, but in how you behave when tested by hardship. He studied me for a long moment, lantern light casting his features in stark relief. Then he laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. You think that blacksmith will take you back? Used goods, raising another man's child? The crude implication stung, but I refused to show it. My future is no longer your concern. And Thomas? You'd abandon an innocent child who looks to you as mother? The question struck my heart like a physical blow. In the months since coming to the Miller farm, I'd grown to love the sweet-natured infant despite his colicky beginnings. His toothless smiles and trusting eyes had claimed a piece of my heart I hadn't known was available to give. I would never abandon Thomas, I said softly. But I cannot marry his father. Harold's expression turned calculating. He needs a mother, and you've nowhere else to go. He stepped closer, his voice softening to the persuasive tone I remembered from his courtship. Let's forget this unpleasantness. We needn't agree on everything to make a suitable match. I took a deliberate step back. There are differences of opinion, Harold, and then there are fundamental differences of character. I've discovered ours are the latter. His face darkened once more. You'll regret this. Where will you go? Back to Boston with no money, or perhaps to Morgan's bed without benefit of marriage. The town already whispers about your Tuesday visit. The crude suggestion brought heat to my cheeks, but I held my ground. I'd rather face poverty with integrity than prosperity without it. Harold stared at me a moment longer before gathering his tools with angry efficiency. Fine, have it your way, but don't expect me to take you back when reality sets in. He shouldered his sack and lifted the lantern. I'll expect you gone by week's end. As he stormed past me toward the house, I remained rooted beside the creek, staring at the dam that had revealed so much. The night air felt suddenly cooler against my skin, as though a fever had broken. Despite the uncertainty stretching before me, homeless again, without prospects or protection, a curious sense of rightness settled in my chest. I had made my choice. Whatever came next, I would face it with my integrity intact. The town hall, hastily converted from the old schoolhouse when the new one was built, overflowed with residents of Timber Creek. Every available chair had been claimed, forcing latecomers to stand along the walls or sit cross-legged on the rough wooden floor. The windows stood open in concession to the stifling heat. The little breeze stirred the limp curtains. I slipped in moments before Mayor Chambers called the meeting to order, finding a space near the back where I could observe without being immediately noticed. My carpetbag waited in Mrs. Wilson's storeroom, containing the few possessions I could claim as truly mine. Thomas was in the care of the wet nurse, arrangements having been made for the afternoon at considerable expense I could ill afford. Harold sat near the front with several other large landowners, his back straight, shoulders squared, with the confidence of a man who believed himself beyond reproach. He hadn't seen me enter, for which I was grateful. Our confrontation 3 nights ago had resulted in glacial silence at the farmhouse, broken only by necessary communication regarding Thomas's care. Folks were here to discuss the water allocation schedule. Mayor Chambers began, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. Mr. Peterson reports the creek's flow has diminished another 20% since our last meeting. We need to adjust accordingly. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I scanned the room, finding Caleb standing against the far wall, arms crossed over his chest. He looked tired, the drought clearly taking its toll on everyone. The Morwin children were absent today, likely at home completing the lessons I'd assigned during my last visit. Before we begin, Fred Peterson interjected, rising from his chair, I'd like to report that strange business up at the bend where the creek enters Miller property. He turned toward Harold. Rode up there yesterday to check water levels, and it looks like someone's built a dam. Creek's a trickle by the time it reaches town. All eyes turned toward Harold, who remained impassive. My land, my water, he said simply. Nothing in the law says different. Outraged voices rose from around the room. That's why my well's gone dry. My children are drinking water hauled 3 miles from the Donovan place. My cattle are dying for lack of drink, while your fields stay green. Mayor Chambers rapped his walking stick sharply against the floor. Order, please, Mr. Miller. While you may have legal right to water on your property, surely you understand the moral obligation to your neighbors during this crisis. Harold shrugged. Every man must look to his own interests. I've crops to save, same as anyone. But you've diverted the entire creek, Mrs. Wilson protested. Not just a share. As accusations flew across the room, I gathered my courage and stepped forward. The mayor noticed my movement and nodded, granting me the floor. A hush fell as I made my way to the center of the room, conscious of curious eyes following my progress. If I may speak, I began, my voice steadier than I felt. I can confirm Mr. Peterson's account. I witnessed Mr. Miller reinforcing the dam 3 nights ago, well after midnight. Harold's head whipped around, his expression darkening as he spotted me for the first time. Elizabeth, he hissed, remember your place. I met his gaze directly. I remember my conscience more clearly. Turning back to address the room at large, I continued. Mr. Miller has indeed constructed a dam that diverts all water from the creek onto his property. When confronted, he expressed no remorse for the suffering this might cause downstream neighbors. Angry muttering swept through the assembly. Harold rose to his feet, face flushed with fury. You dare betray me publicly, after all I've done for you? I'm not betraying you, I replied evenly. I'm telling the truth. There's a difference. You're my betrothed. Your loyalty should be to me, not these, he gestured dismissively at the townspeople, these shopkeepers and laborers. I felt rather than saw Caleb stiffen across the room at the insult, but my attention remained fixed on Harold. My loyalty is to what's right, and what you've done is wrong, Harold. The woman's clearly deranged with the heat. Harold addressed the mayor, his tone dismissive. Overtaxed with caring for my son, I'll take her home now where she belongs. He strode toward me, reaching for my arm. I stepped back, maintaining distance between us. I won't be returning to your home, I said clearly, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the hushed room. Our engagement is ended. Gasps and whispers erupted around us. Harold froze, his expression cycling rapidly through shock, fury, and calculation. Don't be foolish, Elizabeth, he said, lowering his voice to a dangerous timbre. You've nowhere to go, no means of support. Think of Thomas." "I have thought of Thomas," I replied, my heart aching at the mention of the infant I'd come to love. "What example would I set for him, marrying a man who values property above people? Who would let children go thirsty to water his fields?" Harold's face darkened further. "You'll regret this public display. I demand you return to the farm immediately as a properly obedient wife-to-be. We'll discuss your confusion in private." The threat underlying his words sent a chill through me despite the stifling heat of the crowded room. I was keenly aware of the spectacle we presented, of the whispers circulating, of the position in which I was placing myself. A woman alone, without family or fortune, casting aside security for principle. With deliberate movements, I removed the small ruby ring Harold had placed on my finger weeks earlier, a ring I'd never quite grown accustomed to wearing. I held it out toward him, palm open. "I cannot and will not marry a man whose values are so opposed to my own," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Whatever hardships await me, they are preferable to a lifetime bound to someone who could behave as you have." Harold stared at the ring as though it were a venomous snake. "You'll be destitute within a week," he hissed, begging me to take you back. "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "but I'll face poverty with my integrity intact." When he made no move to take the ring, I placed it carefully on the table beside me, the small clink of metal against wood audible in the hushed room. Then, with as much dignity as I could muster, I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Harold's voice rise in fury. "Stop her! She's hysterical, overheated. She doesn't know what she's saying." I continued walking, back straight, eyes forward. Each step felt both terrifying and liberating, carrying me away from security and status, yet toward something infinitely more precious. Self-respect. As I reached the door, Mrs. Wilson rose from her seat and joined me, her weathered hand slipping supportively through my arm. "You'll stay with us tonight, dear," she whispered. "Fred has already made up the spare room." Tears pricked my eyes at this unexpected kindness, but I blinked them back. I would not give Harold the satisfaction of seeing me weep. Outside, the afternoon sun blazed mercilessly from a cloudless sky. I paused on the town hall steps, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what I'd done. I was homeless again, without position or prospects, in a frontier town where a woman alone had few respectable options. Yet as Mrs. Wilson patted my arm reassuringly, as townspeople began emerging from the hall with expressions ranging from shock to admiration, I felt a curious lightness replace the dread that had weighed on me for weeks. I had stood my ground. Whatever came next, however difficult the path, I would walk it with a clear conscience and my head held high. Chapter 8. Hearts Forged Anew. For 3 days following my public severance from Harold Miller, I inhabited a small room above Wilson's general store. The sloped ceiling pressed low at the edges, forcing me to duck my head when approaching the narrow window that overlooked Timber Creek's dusty Main Street. The space was spare but tidy, a narrow bed with a faded quilt, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a three-legged stool that wobbled slightly on the uneven floorboards. Mrs. Wilson had insisted I accept her hospitality until things sort themselves out, as she delicately phrased it. In truth, my prospects were alarmingly limited. I had $7.43 to my name, not nearly enough for passage back east, nor sufficient to establish independent lodging in Timber Creek. On the morning of the 4th day, I sat on the edge of the bed, carefully darning a tear in my second-best shirtwaist. The garment had seen better days, the fabric thinning at the elbows, but skilled needlework might extend its life another season. I'd already secured permission from Mrs. Wilson to help in the store, in exchange for my room and board. Not an ideal arrangement, but preferable to returning to Harold in defeat. The hardest part had been separating from Thomas. His small face, growing increasingly familiar with my features, had crumpled in distress when I kissed him goodbye. Harold had refused to allow me continued access to the infant, using the child as a final weapon to punish my defiance. The ache of that separation sat like a stone beneath my breastbone, persistent and unyielding. A clatter on the stairs interrupted my melancholy thoughts. followed by Mrs. Wilson's breathless voice, calling my name. "Elizabeth! Elizabeth! Come quickly!" She appeared in the doorway, her usually tidy gray hair escaping its pins, color high in her plump cheeks. "There's a telegram for you." I set aside my mending, heart stuttering with sudden anxiety. In my experience, telegrams rarely brought happy tidings. "From whom?" "A law office in Boston. Goodness, child, don't just sit there. Come down and read it." I followed her down the narrow staircase, smoothing my hair self-consciously as we entered the store. Several customers browsed the shelves, casting curious glances in my direction. My public confrontation with Harold had cemented my position as an object of town gossip, though opinions seemed divided between those who considered me foolishly principled and those who admired my stand against his selfishness. Mrs. Wilson handed me a yellow paper, practically vibrating with curiosity. "Go on, then. I've been dying to know what's so important a fancy Boston lawyer would spend money on a telegram." With trembling fingers, I unfolded the message, scanning the terse phrases customary to telegram communication. "And Miss Elizabeth Foster, stop a regret-informed death. Ambrose Foster, your uncle, stop, as sole surviving relative. You inherit entire estate, stop. Estimated value $40,000, stop. Awaiting instructions regarding distribution, stop. Sinclair and Whitaker, attorneys. Boston, stop." The paper slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers. Mrs. Wilson snatched it before it hit the floor, her eyes widening as she read the contents. "Merciful heavens," she breathed. $40,000? Elizabeth, you're rich!" The room tilted alarmingly, and I gripped the edge of the counter for support. Uncle Ambrose, my father's elder brother, with whom we'd had no contact for nearly 15 years, following a bitter family quarrel. I'd met the man precisely twice in my life, finding him austere and intimidating. That he would leave me his entire fortune seemed incomprehensible. "There must be some mistake," I whispered. "No mistake with lawyers involved," Mrs. Wilson declared, reading the telegram again. "Sole surviving relative, it says, plain as day. Your parents being gone and you without siblings. It all makes sense." My mind raced, struggling to grasp the implications. $40,000, a fortune beyond imagining, enough to return to Boston in comfort, to establish myself in any city I chose, to live independently without fear of poverty for the rest of my days. "You'll be leaving us then," Mrs. Wilson said sadly, correctly interpreting my stunned silence. "Back to Boston society, where you belong." I opened my mouth to respond, though what I might have said remains a mystery. At that moment, the store's bell jangled sharply as the door flew open with such force that it bounced against the wall. Young Michael Morgan stood in the doorway, face flushed from running, straw-colored hair standing on end. "Miss Foster," he panted, "is it true? Jimmy Walker says you got a telegram saying you're rich now and going back east." Behind him appeared the twins, equally breathless, their copper braids coming undone. "Please don't go," Emma cried, pushing past her brother. "We need you here." I stared at them in bewilderment. "How on earth?" "Billy Tucker was at the telegraph office when Mr. Simmons received your message," Hannah explained, grabbing my hand. "He told his mother, who told Mrs. Peterson, who told practically the whole town by now," Mrs. Wilson finished with a sigh. "Nothing travels faster than news in Timber Creek." Samuel appeared in the doorway next, Sarah's small hand clutched in his. Unlike his siblings, he maintained a dignified restraint, though I could see the apprehension in his eyes as he assessed my expression. "We were practicing our lessons," he said with forced casualness. "The little ones overheard Mrs. Tucker talking and insisted on confirming the rumor themselves." "It's not true, is it?" Sarah's small voice quavered. "You promised you wouldn't leave us again?" 5 pairs of eyes fixed on me with expressions ranging from open distress to barely concealed panic. My heart twisted painfully in my chest. These children, who had suffered so much loss already, feared abandonment yet again, this time by choice rather than circumstance. "Children," I began, then faltered, unsure what to promise. The telegram in Mrs. Wilson's hand represented freedom, opportunity, a return to the world I'd left behind. Yet the thought of leaving these dear faces, of never again hearing Samuel's reluctant laughter, or witnessing Sarah's careful penmanship, or feeling Michael's impulsive hugs, created an emptiness I could scarcely bear to contemplate. And their father. Caleb Morgan's face rose unbidden in my mind, with his steady gray eyes and quiet strength. What might have developed between us had circumstances been different? What might still be possible now that my future held new possibilities? Miss Foster needs time to consider her options, Mrs. Wilson interjected, correctly interpreting my silence. This news has come as quite a shock, but you will tell us before you decide, Emma pleaded. Before you leave? I promise, I managed, gently disentangling my hand from her grip. Now, shouldn't you be continuing your studies? What would your father say about this impromptu visit to town? Samuel straightened. He doesn't know. He's at the blacksmith shop with Mr. Peterson's wagon. We're supposed to be doing our arithmetic. Then I suggest you return home immediately and apply yourselves to your lessons, I said, summoning a firmness I was far from feeling. I'll speak with you all very soon. They departed reluctantly, casting backward glances as they filed out the door. Only Samuel lingered a moment longer, his young face solemn beyond his years. Pa's not been the same since you left, he said quietly, in case that matters to your decision. Before I could respond, he was gone, hurrying to catch his siblings. I stared after him, his simple statement echoing in my mind like the peal of a church bell. Mrs. Wilson patted my arm sympathetically. Quite a morning you're having, my dear. Perhaps some tea to settle your nerves. I nodded absently, my thoughts in turmoil. The telegram, with its incredible news, rested on the counter, a key unlocking doors I'd believed forever closed to me. Yet Samuel's parting words had opened another door entirely, one leading not east toward my past, but forward into a future I'd scarcely allowed myself to imagine. That evening, I composed a careful response to Messrs. Sinclair and Whitaker, requesting they transfer a modest portion of my inheritance to the Timber Creek Bank while I considered my long-term plans. The vague wording masked my own uncertainty, a hesitation that would have seemed incomprehensible to the young woman who had journeyed west with such clear purpose months ago. Mrs. Wilson had insisted I move from the cramped attic room to her own spare bedroom, declaring that an heiress shouldn't be knocking her head on roof beams. I protested the special treatment but eventually acquiesced, touched by her motherly concern. The new room, while modest by Boston standards, felt positively luxurious after my recent accommodations. A proper bed with turned posts, a washstand with matching pitcher and bowl, even a small writing desk positioned beneath a lace-curtained window. I arranged my few possessions, marveling at how quickly circumstances could change, from engaged woman to homeless spinster to unexpected heiress, all in the span of a single season. As darkness fell, I prepared for bed, my mind still churning with possibilities. The inheritance offered a freedom few women ever experience, the ability to shape my life according to my own desires, rather than necessity or convention. I could return to teaching if I wished, establish a small school perhaps. I could travel, see the wonders I'd only read about in books. I could return to Boston society, though the thought held less appeal than it once might have. Or I could stay in Timber Creek, where 5 children had claimed pieces of my heart, where their father— I shook my head sharply, refusing to complete the thought. Caleb Morgan had encouraged me to accept Harold's proposal, had all but pushed me from his home. If he harbored deeper feelings, as Samuel had implied, he had hidden them remarkably well. A soft thud from the hallway interrupted my ruminations. I paused in brushing my hair, listening intently. Another sound follows, a whispered shh that triggered immediate suspicion. Setting down my brush, I moved quietly to the door and eased it open a crack. The sight that greeted me would have been comical under different circumstances. 5 figures crouched in the darkened hallway outside my room, the Morgan children, attempting stealth with varying degrees of success. Samuel knelt before the door, something metallic glinting in his hand. Michael vibrated with poorly contained excitement, while the twins kept anxious watch. Sarah clutched her rag doll, eyes enormous in her pale face. Before I could announce my presence, Mrs. Wilson emerged from her own bedroom, lamp held high. "What in heaven's name, Samuel Morgan? Are you picking that lock?" 5 heads snapped up, expressions ranging from defiance to mortification. Samuel hastily concealed what appeared to be a bent nail behind his back. "Evening, Mrs. Wilson," he attempted casually. "We were just checking on Miss Foster, making sure she's comfortable. At 9 o'clock at night." Through a locked door, Mrs. Wilson's tone could have frozen Timber Creek solid in August. "I believe the word for this is breaking and entering, young man." Emma burst into tears. "We just wanted to hide the money." "Emma," Samuel hissed, "be quiet." "Hide what money?" Mrs. Wilson demanded, her voice rising. "The telegram money," Michael supplied helpfully, earning a withering glare from his elder brother. "So Miss Foster can't leave Timber Creek." Mrs. Wilson stared at them in astonishment. "Of all the harebrained foolish," she broke off, pressing her fingers to her temples. "Where is your father while you're out committing burglary?" "At the smithy," Samuel admitted, shoulders slumping in defeat. "Working late on the Donovan order. He thinks we're abed." I stepped fully into the hallway, unable to remain hidden any longer. "Children, what were you thinking?" 5 guilty faces turned toward me. Hannah stepped forward, fiddling with the end of her braid. "We just thought, if you couldn't get the inheritance money right away, maybe you'd stay longer, long enough to realize you belong here with us." "And not in fancy Boston," Michael added earnestly. The guileless admission pierced my heart. "So you planned to steal the telegram or the bank draft when it arrives?" "Not steal," Samuel corrected quickly. "Just hide until you changed your mind about leaving." "We'd have given it back," Emma assured me, tears still streaming down her freckled cheeks. "Once you decided to stay forever." Mrs. Wilson made a sound that might have been exasperation or smothered laughter. "Well, I never, breaking into a lady's room to steal her inheritance for her own good, the nerve. I should have been angry. Their scheme was misguided, potentially criminal, certainly disrespectful of my property and privacy. Yet looking at their anxious faces, these children who had already endured the loss of their mother and feared losing me as well, I found my heart softening like wax near flame. I knelt before them, gathering my nightdress around my knees. "Come here, all of you." They approached warily, perhaps expecting a scolding. Instead, I opened my arms, and after a moment's hesitation, they surged forward. Sarah reached me first, her small body pressing against mine with desperate intensity. The twins followed, then Michael, and finally Samuel, his adolescent dignity warring with his need for reassurance. "I'm not angry," I murmured, stroking Sarah's hair. "Disappointed in your methods, yes, but touched by your motive. We don't want you to go," Michael mumbled against my shoulder. "Not ever." I drew back slightly, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "I want you to listen very carefully. I haven't made any decisions about my future yet, but I promise you this. I am not planning to leave Timber Creek." Hope bloomed across their faces, though Samuel remained cautious. "What about Boston?" he asked. "Your inheritance?" "Money doesn't dictate where one must live," I explained gently. "It merely provides more choices about how and where one lives." "So you might stay?" Emma pressed. "Even though you're rich now?" "I'm considering it very seriously," I admitted, the truth of the statement surprising even me. "This town has come to mean a great deal to me. As have all of you." The tension drained from their small bodies, relief palpable in the suddenly lighter atmosphere. Mrs. Wilson watched us with an expression that mingled exasperation and tenderness in equal measure. "Now," I continued more sternly, "breaking into rooms and plotting to hide other people's possessions is wrong, no matter how well-intentioned. Do you understand?" 5 heads nodded solemnly. "Good. Then I expect you to apologize to Mrs. Wilson for disturbing her household, and to return directly home before your father discovers your absence." "Yes, ma'am," they chorused. "And tomorrow," I added, "you'll each write a full page on the importance of respecting others' property and privacy." Groans met this pronouncement, though they were markedly less aggrieved than they might have been under different circumstances. You heard Miss Foster, Mrs. Wilson interjected. Home with you now, before that father of yours realizes you've been gallivanting around town in your nightclothes. They filed toward the stairs, pausing for hasty apologies to Mrs. Wilson. Samuel lingered last, his expression troubled. Miss Foster, he said quietly, we truly are sorry. We just couldn't bear the thought of you leaving again. I touched his cheek gently. I understand, Samuel. More than you know. After they had gone, Mrs. Wilson shook her head wonderingly. Those children love you something fierce, Elizabeth. Breaking and entering. Lord have mercy. They've known too much loss already, I said softly. Their mother, then me when I went to the Miller farm. They feared another abandonment. And their father? Mrs. Wilson's shrewd eyes assessed me carefully. What of his feelings in this matter? Heat rose in my cheeks. Mr. Morgan has expressed no particular interest in my remaining in Timber Creek. That man could express interest in the second coming and still look like he's discussing horseshoe nails. She patted my arm affectionately. Some treasures need a bit of digging to uncover, my dear. Don't mistake a man's reserve for lack of feeling. As I returned to my room, her words echoed in my mind, mingling with Samuel's earlier statement. Pa's not been the same since you left. For the first time since receiving the telegram, I allowed myself to fully consider a future in Timber Creek. Not as Harold Miller's wife or as a temporary arrangement until better prospects arose, but as a deliberate choice. The inheritance meant I could build a life on my own terms, perhaps a small house near the school, where I might teach again. Independence, but with proximity to 5 children who had claimed my heart so completely. And perhaps in time their father might reveal whether Samuel's words held truth, whether the quiet blacksmith, who had once urged me toward another man's arms, might now wish me to remain within reach of his own. The thought warmed me as I slipped beneath the covers, a smile curving my lips as I drifted toward sleep. The inheritance was indeed a blessing, but not for the reasons anyone might have supposed. Not as a means of escape, but as the key to a door I'd believed forever close, the door to a future of my own choosing, in a place where my heart had unexpectedly found home. 2 weeks after the inheritance telegram arrived, I stood beside Mayor Chambers on the vacant lot at the north end of Timber Creek. Spring had finally brought gentle rains, transforming the parched landscape with tender green shoots and wildflowers dotting the prairie. The acre of land before us, situated on a slight rise overlooking the town, caught the morning sunlight in a way that seemed almost divinely ordained for its new purpose. It's perfect, I declared, turning to the mayor. I'll take it. Mayor Chambers beamed, removing his hat to wipe his brow. The town council will be mighty pleased, Miss Foster. Timber Creek's needed a proper schoolhouse for years, but funds were always directed elsewhere. I smiled, surveying what would soon become Timber Creek's first dedicated school building. The current arrangement, cramped quarters in the back room of the town hall, had served well enough when the settlement was younger and smaller. But with new families arriving each season, the children of Timber Creek deserved better. The papers will be ready to sign tomorrow, the mayor continued, replacing his hat. 15 acres at $20 per, inclusive of water rights from the North Creek. A fair price, though I say it myself. More than fair, I agreed. And the remaining funds should cover construction costs, with something left over for supplies and a modest teacher's salary. You intend to teach, then? He studied me with undisguised curiosity. Town gossip had run rampant since my inheritance became known, with speculation ranging from my imminent departure for Boston through rumors of my purchasing the entire Miller farm out of spite. I do, I confirmed. Teaching has always been my true calling. What I didn't add was how right it felt to direct my unexpected fortune toward creating something lasting for the community that had, despite its initial wariness, come to feel like home. The decision had crystallized gradually in the days following the children's thwarted burglary attempt. A recognition that wealth's true value lay in its capacity to build rather than merely possess. Well, the children will benefit greatly from your expertise, Mayor Chambers observed, and your generosity. The town council was right impressed with your building plans. I smiled, thinking of the detailed drawings I'd labored over, incorporating ideas gleaned from the most progressive schools back east. Large windows to admit ample natural light, proper ventilation, separate cloakrooms for boys and girls, even a small library alcove. Speaking of the plans, I said, I've decided to commission Mr. Morgan for all the metalwork, door hinges, latches, brackets, and such. His craftsmanship is exceptional. The mayor's eyes twinkled knowingly. Is that so? Well, Morgan's the finest blacksmith this side of Cheyenne. No argument there, though some might wonder if there aren't other reasons for your selection. Heat rose in my cheeks. Since ending my engagement to Harold, I'd been acutely conscious of town speculation regarding my relationship with Caleb. The continued weekly lessons with his children had only fueled such talk, though Caleb himself maintained a careful, almost formal politeness during my visits. His work speaks for itself, I replied with as much dignity as I could muster. If you'll excuse me, I should inform him of the commission before the council makes its announcements. I headed directly for the smithy, my steps quickening with both anticipation and nervousness. Since the night the children had attempted to save my inheritance, I'd been turning Samuel's words over in my mind. Pa's not been the same since you left. Could it be true? Had Caleb truly missed me as more than a convenient solution to his domestic troubles? The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil guided me to the smithy at the edge of town. I paused in the open doorway, momentarily transfixed by the sight before me. Caleb stood at his forge, stripped to the waist in concession to the heat, muscles rippling across his back and shoulders as he shaped glowing metal with practiced precision. Sweat gleamed on his skin, highlighting the play of strength beneath. I must have made some small sound, for he turned suddenly, hammer poised mid-strike. Recognition flickered across his features, followed by something else. A warmth quickly masked by his customary reserve. Miss Foster, he acknowledged, setting down his hammer and reaching for the shirt draped over a nearby barrel. Didn't expect visitors this morning. I averted my eyes as he shrugged into the garment, heat rising in my cheeks that had nothing to do with the forge's glow. Forgive the intrusion. I can return later if you're occupied. No need. He buttoned the shirt with work-roughened fingers. What brings you by? The children are at school. Or meant to be, unless they've found more mischief to involve themselves in. His tone held a hint of wry humor, reference to their attempted burglary of my room. The incident had required a sheepish confession from Samuel when Mrs. Wilson insisted on informing Caleb of his children's nighttime escapade. Actually, I've come to discuss business, I explained, stepping fully into the smithy. The familiar smells of coal smoke, hot metal, and leather surrounded me, oddly comforting despite their intensity. I've purchased land for a new schoolhouse, and I'd like to commission you for the metalwork. Surprise registered briefly in his gray eyes. A schoolhouse? I nodded, excitement returning as I outlined my plans. Nothing elaborate, but suitable for the town's needs. 2 rooms to start, with provisions for expansion as Timber Creek grows. Mayor Chambers thinks we might begin construction within the month, now that the spring rains have softened the ground. Your inheritance, he said, understanding dawning. You're using it to build a school rather than return east. This is where I belong now, I said simply. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a tension releasing across his shoulders. The children will be pleased to hear it. They've talked of little else these past weeks, fretting you'd leave once your affairs were settled. And you, Mr. Morgan? The question escaped before prudence could prevent it. Would you be pleased if I remained in Timber Creek? Caleb stilled, his gaze holding mine with sudden intensity. For a breathless moment, the smithy fell silent save for the soft crackle of the forge and the distant call of meadowlarks through the open door. I encourage you to accept Miller's proposal, he said finally, his voice low and rough. I told myself it was for your benefit, that you deserved better than keeping house for a blacksmith and his wild brood. I never saw it as merely keeping house, I ventured, heart hammering against my ribs. I know that now. He moved closer close enough that I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, smell the wood smoke embedded in his skin. When you left, it was like the light went out of our home. The children felt it, I felt it, but my cursed pride wouldn't let me admit I'd made the worst mistake of my life, letting you go. My breath caught. Caleb, let me finish, he interrupted gently. I need to say this plainly, so there's no confusion between us. I love you. Elizabeth Foster. Have loved you since you faced down my sullen son and taught my daughters to make proper biscuits and coaxed words from Sarah when she'd been silent for months. Joy bloomed in my chest, so intense it bordered on pain. Why didn't you say something? All those months, what could I offer that would compare to Miller's prosperity? A modest home, 5 half-wild children, the uncertain income of a blacksmith during drought? His laugh held no humor. It seemed kinder to step aside, to let you find security in position with a man who could provide what I couldn't. What you couldn't provide in material comforts, you gave tenfold in other ways, I said softly, reaching for his hand. His fingers closed around mine, calloused and warm. I never wanted Harold's farm or his status. I realized too late that my heart already resided in a small house at the edge of town, with a family that had claimed it without my notice or permission. Disbelief warred with hope in his expression. Truly? Even before your inheritance? Even then, I smiled, blinking back sudden tears. I've loved you for months, Caleb Morgan, but I believed you saw me only as a convenient solution to your household troubles. With a sound that might have been a laugh or a groan, he drew me into his arms. I went willingly, fitting against his solid strength as though the space had been crafted precisely for me. We've wasted precious time with misunderstandings, he murmured, against my hair. Perhaps not wasted, I countered, nestling closer. Perhaps we needed that time apart to recognize what truly mattered. His hand cupped my cheek, tilting my face upward. And what matters to you, Elizabeth Foster, now that the world lies open before you? The answer came without hesitation. A life of purpose, a place to belong, and a family to love who loves me in return. His eyes darkened with emotion. I can promise you the latter without reservation. The children already consider you theirs. And their father? I whispered, scaring the tree. In answer, he lowered his mouth to mine. The kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. Then, as my arms twined around his neck, it deepened into something that spoke more eloquently than words of longing, finally fulfilled, of hearts finding their true home. When we finally parted, breathless and flushed, Caleb pressed his forehead to mine. Does that answer your question, Miss Foster? I laughed, joy bubbling up irrepressibly. The sound of running footsteps and childish voices outside reminded us suddenly of our public location. We stepped apart, though Caleb kept my hand firmly within his own, as though unwilling to relinquish contact now that barriers between us had finally fallen. We should discuss your commission, he said, a smile tugging at his mouth as he gestured toward his workbench. Proper hinges and latches for a schoolhouse require careful planning. Indeed they do, I agreed, following his lead with equal parts amusement and tenderness. And I can think of no craftsman more suited to the task. As we bent over the rough sketches I'd brought, shoulders touching, future plans taking shape between us, I marveled at how life's harshest disappointments could become the forge from which unexpected happiness was hammered into being. The schoolhouse frame rose against the June sky like the skeleton of some great beached vessel, its timber ribs stark and promising against the endless blue. Construction had progressed rapidly once the town council approved the plans, with men from every household contributing labor in exchange for reduced school fees. Even Harold Miller, perhaps sensing the tide of community opinion, had grudgingly sent 2 of his farmhands to assist with the heavy beam raising. I visited the site daily, watching with growing excitement as walls took shape and windows were framed. Today marked a milestone, the completion of the roof structure, with only the shingling still to come. A small American flag had been hoisted atop the highest beam, fluttering proudly in the prairie breeze. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the partially completed floor as I picked my way carefully among stacks of lumber and coils of rope. Most of the workers had departed for their evening meals, leaving the site eerily quiet after weeks of constant hammering and sawing. I relished these solitary inspections, imagining future generations of Timber Creek children learning their letters and sums within these walls. My fingers traced the smooth surface of a window frame, admiring the precision of the joinery. So absorbed was I in examining the craftsmanship that I failed to notice approaching footsteps until a small voice spoke directly behind me. "Do you like it, Miss Foster?" I turned to find Sarah Morgan, regarding me solemnly, her ragdoll clutched to her chest as always. In the months since I'd begun teaching the children regularly again, her vocabulary had expanded remarkably, though she remained more reserved than her siblings. "I like it very much," I replied, smiling. "But what are you doing here all alone, young lady? Does your father know where you are?" "I'm not alone," she informed me with quiet dignity. "Everyone's hiding." "Hiding?" I glanced around the empty building site with sudden wariness. "Whatever for?" Sarah's small hand slipped into mine, tugging me toward the eastern wall where the doorframe stood waiting for its hinges. "It's a surprise, come see." Mystified, I allowed her to lead me outside, where the slanting light turned the spring grasses to spun gold. There, beneath a cottonwood tree festooned with paper chains and ribbon, stood Caleb and his 4 other children. They had clearly prepared for this moment, dressed in their Sunday best, despite the workday afternoon, faces scrubbed pink and hair slicked into unaccustomed neatness. "What's all this?" I asked, laughter bubbling in my voice. "A construction celebration?" Caleb stepped forward, suddenly seeming uncharacteristically nervous. He'd exchanged his smithy clothes for a clean shirt and pressed trousers, his dark hair combed neatly and beard freshly trimmed. "Not exactly," he said, his deep voice carrying a slight tremor. "The children and I have been planning something. Each has a part to play, if you're willing to indulge us." Curious, I nodded, and Samuel stepped forward first. At 14, he'd grown taller in recent months, his frame beginning to fill out with muscle earned from helping at the forge. From behind his back, he produced a small wooden box, its surface polished to a warm glow. "I made this for your teaching supplies," he said, the formal delivery suggesting rehearsed lines, "so you'll always have a place to keep what matters." Touched, I accepted the beautifully crafted container, noting the intricate dovetail joints and the delicate carving of my initials on the lid. "It's exquisite, Samuel." "Thank you." The twins came next, giggling with barely contained excitement. Emma held out a paper-wrapped object while Hannah practically danced with impatience. "We embroidered this," Emma announced. "For your desk at the new school," Hannah added. Unwrapping the paper revealed a small cushion, carefully stitched with wildflowers and the words, "Miss Foster's Schoolroom," in somewhat uneven but heartfelt embroidery. "How thoughtful," I said, genuinely moved by their effort. "I shall place it on my chair every day." Michael bounded forward next, unable to maintain the dignified pace his siblings had established. In his hands he clutched a crude clay figure, its features indistinct but its intention unmistakable. "It's you," he declared proudly, "teaching. See the book?" He pointed to a misshapen lump that might, with imagination, resemble an open volume. "Now you can't forget what you look like when you're explaining things." I laughed, accepting the ungainly creation with appropriate solemnity. "Why, it's the very image of me." "How clever you are, Michael." Sarah tugged at my skirt, her turn apparently next. From her pocket she withdrew a small cloth pouch, loosening its drawstring with careful fingers before tipping the contents into my palm. A collection of beach-smoothed pebbles tumbled out, each painted with the letter of the alphabet in surprisingly neat script. "For teaching little ones their letters," she explained seriously. "Like you taught me." Tears pricked my eyes at the thoughtfulness behind each gift. "These are wonderful presents," I said, looking from one expectant face to another. "But what's the occasion? It's not my birthday?" Caleb cleared his throat, stepping forward to take my free hand in his. "The occasion," he said softly, is one I should have created months ago, if I'd had the courage to speak my heart. Around us, the children arranged themselves in a semicircle, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and barely contained excitement. Even Samuel seemed to have abandoned his usual adolescent reserve, watching the proceedings with undisguised interest. Elizabeth Foster, Caleb continued, his voice steadying as he held my gaze. You came to Timber Creek, seeking one future, and found another. You brought order to our chaos, light to our darkness, and love to a household that had forgotten its meaning. My heart began a wild rhythm against my ribs as I realized what was happening. The children's gifts, their careful preparations, Caleb's uncharacteristic speech-making, it all suddenly coalesced into understanding. In the months you were gone, he went on, we discovered that what makes a house a home isn't the cooking or the cleaning, but the heart that transforms mere shelter into sanctuary. Your heart, Elizabeth? From his pocket, he withdrew something small that caught the afternoon sunlight with a gentle glow. A ring, its band fashioned from what appeared to be silver, topped with a small pearl, nestled in delicate metalwork. I made this, he said, a touch of professional pride entering his voice. Traded 4 sets of wagon wheel rims for the pearl. It's not as fine as what Miller offered, but it's perfect, I interrupted, my voice thick with emotion. Absolutely perfect. Hope blazed in his gray eyes. Then you know what I'm asking? I believe I do, I managed through the tightness in my throat. But I'd like to hear the words all the same. Caleb smiled, then surprised me by dropping to one knee before me, still clasping my hand in his. Elizabeth Foster, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife, of making our family complete, of allowing me to cherish you for all our days? Before I could respond, Sarah stepped forward, her small face solemn with purpose. Will you be our mother for real? She asked, the directness of a child cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Not just for lessons and visits? The simple question, delivered with such earnest hope, unleashed the tears I'd been struggling to contain. They spilled down my cheeks, unchecked, as I looked from Sarah to Caleb to the other children, each face reflecting the same yearning for belonging that had driven my own journey west. Yes, I said, the single syllable carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Yes to being your wife, I told Caleb, then, turning to the children, and yes to being your mother, for real and forever. Joy erupted around me as the children broke formation, enveloping me in a tangle of arms and exclamations. I felt Caleb rise and join the embrace, his strong arms encircling all of us as though he could physically bind us together through sheer will. When the initial excitement subsided, he gently disentangled me from the children long enough to slip the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly, the pearl gleaming against my skin like a promise made tangible. I was so afraid you'd use your inheritance to return east, he admitted quietly. When you decided to build the school instead, I began to hope. My life is here now, I told him, reaching up to touch his face. With you, with these children, with this community. Around us, the partially constructed schoolhouse stood, as testament to that commitment. My inheritance transformed into a legacy that would serve generations of Timber Creek children. But the true investment of my heart stood before me, 5 children, and the man who had forged both metal and family with equal care and devotion. As Caleb lowered his mouth to mine, sealing our promise with a kiss that held both tenderness and passion, I understood with perfect clarity what had eluded me for so long. The detour that had seemed a cruel trick of fate, Harold's betrayal, my desperate acceptance of a position beneath my station, had been divine guidance all along, leading me not to mere employment or marriage of convenience, but to authentic love and belonging. The blacksmith's strong arms tightened around me, and I knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever life brought next, drought or plenty, hardship or ease, we would face it together. A family forged in adversity's flame, but tempered by love's steady hand. Epilogue. Wedding day. September arrived in a glory of golden light. painting the prairie in rich ambers and russets that stretched to the distant mountains. The schoolhouse, completed just days before, stood proudly atop its gentle rise, windows gleaming in the morning sun like welcoming eyes. Fresh white paint brightened the clapboard exterior, while inside, pine floors had been polished to a honeyed sheen, and rows of new desks awaited the children, who would soon fill them with life and learning. Today, however, the building served a different purpose. Timber Creek's residents had transformed the main classroom into a chapel of sorts, with wildflowers and ribbon-twined branches adorning every available surface. Benches borrowed from the church had been arranged in neat rows, now filled with townspeople in their Sunday finest, faces expectant beneath bonnets and bowlers. I waited in the small anteroom that would soon serve as my office, smoothing nervous hands over the ivory silk of my wedding gown. Mrs. Wilson had gifted me the dress, her own from 30 years prior, carefully preserved in lavender-scented tissue. With the twins' help, we'd altered the bodice and added delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, creating something both elegant and appropriate for a school-teacher bride. "You look beautiful," Emma declared, adjusting the crown of meadow flowers she and Hannah had woven for my hair, "like a princess in one of your storybooks." Hannah nodded eager agreement. "Pa won't be able to speak when he sees you. His mouth will just hang open, like the time Michael fell in the creek with his new boots on." I laughed, grateful for their chatter that distracted from the nervous flutter in my stomach. "I certainly hope he regains his speech before the vows. It would be rather awkward to have a mute groom, don't you think?" Sarah, solemn in a blue dress, with white pinafore, clutched my hand. "Are you scared?" she whispered. I knelt carefully, mindful of wrinkling the silk. "Just a little nervous," I admitted. "But the very best kind of nervous, like Christmas Eve or the first day of school?" She nodded, understanding perfectly. "My tummy feels fluttery too, but happy fluttery." A knock at the door preceded Samuel's entrance. At 14, he looked startlingly grown up in his new suit, hair slicked back with Macassar oil, his expression wavering between manly dignity and boyish excitement. "Pastor says it's time," he announced, offering his arm with careful formality. "Ready, Miss Foster? Or I guess this is the last time I'll call you that." I took his arm, heart swelling with love for this young man who had volunteered to escort me down the aisle in place of the father long since gone to his reward. "I'm ready," I assured him, gathering my small bouquet of late summer roses. The children lined up before us. First Michael, bearing the small velvet cushion that held the rings, then the twins with their baskets of flower petals, and finally Sarah, clutching a ribbon-wrapped Bible. As Samuel opened the door, the soft strains of Mrs. Peterson's parlor organ washed over us, playing a hymn I'd loved since childhood. The assembled townspeople rose as we entered, faces turning expectantly toward the makeshift bridal procession. I hardly noticed them, for at the front of the room, beside Pastor Walsh, stood Caleb. His dark eyes found mine immediately, and the naked emotion in his gaze nearly stole my breath. He wore a new black suit, his shoulders filling it magnificently, his usual workman's stubble replaced by a neatly trimmed beard. Sarah led the procession with careful steps, followed in scattering petals from their baskets with more enthusiasm than precision. Michael came next, his face a study in concentration as he balanced the ring cushion with exaggerated care. As Samuel and I began our journey down the petal-strewn aisle, I felt a curious sense of coming home with each step that brought me closer to Caleb. The journey that had begun with betrayal and desperation had led, through providence I could only attribute to divine guidance, to this moment of perfect rightness. The family I'd traveled west to create would bear no resemblance to what I'd imagined, yet would surpass those limited dreams in every measure that mattered. When we reached the front, Samuel placed my hand in Caleb's with a solemnity that belied his years, then joined his siblings in the front row. Caleb's fingers closed around mine, warm and strong, his calloused palm a testament to honest labor and steadfast provision. "You're beautiful," he whispered, voice husky with emotion. Pastor Walsh smiled benevolently at us both before addressing the gathering. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and this community to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The familiar words washed over me as I stood beside the man who had captured my heart so unexpectedly. The children watched from the front row, their faces shining with a joy that mirrored my own. Mrs. Wilson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Mr. Peterson beamed beside her. Even Mayor Chambers looked suspiciously misty-eyed as the ceremony progressed. As we prepared to exchange our vows, a slight disturbance at the back of the room caught my attention. The schoolhouse door had opened, admitting a late arrival. Harold Miller, looking somewhat uncomfortable in his Sunday suit, a small bundle cradled awkwardly in his arms. My breath caught at the sight of little Thomas, now 8 months old, and peering curiously at the assembled crowd from his father's embrace. Harold caught my gaze and offered a small, uncertain nod. 3 months had passed since our confrontation over the creek dam, during which we'd exchanged no words beyond the most necessary pleasantries when passing in town. His appearance at our wedding was unexpected, to say the least. Caleb had noticed him too, his hand tightening slightly around mine. We exchanged a glance, and I saw no anger in his eyes, only a steady question. I squeezed his fingers reassuringly, grateful beyond words for this man who would allow me to navigate this moment in my own way. Pastor Walsh, unaware of the undercurrents, continued serenely, "Caleb Morgan, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" Caleb's voice rang clear and certain. "I do." "And Elizabeth Foster, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" "I do," I answered, the words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "The rings, please," Pastor Walsh requested, and Michael stepped forward importantly, presenting the cushion with our wedding bands. Caleb lifted the smaller ring, a simple gold band that matched the engagement ring he'd crafted, now complemented by this more traditional symbol of marriage. "This ring," he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the room, "I forged myself from gold panned in Timber Creek. I heated it in fire, shaped it with hammer and anvil, and polished it to brightness. Just as our love has been tested by fire, shaped by challenge, and emerged stronger for the trials it has endured." Tears blurred my vision as he slipped the ring onto my finger, his work-roughened hands infinitely gentle. "With this ring I thee wed," he concluded, the traditional words carrying his own unique promise. When I had placed the matching band on his finger and spoken my own vows, Pastor Walsh smiled broadly. "By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." He closed his Bible with a satisfied nod. "You may kiss your bride." Caleb's arms encircled me, drawing me close as his lips met mine in a kiss that managed to be both decorous enough for public viewing and passionate enough to promise much more when privacy allowed. The assembled townsfolk erupted in applause and cheers, none louder than the Morgan children, my children now, in heart if not yet by law. As we turned to face our friends and neighbors, 5 small bodies surrounded us in a spontaneous group embrace that drew laughter and a few more tears from the witnesses. Through the happy chaos, I noticed Harold making his way slowly toward us, Thomas bouncing on his hip. The room gradually quieted as he approached, curious eyes following his progress. Caleb's arm tightened protectively around my waist, but his expression remained composed as Harold stopped before us. "Miss Faust, Mrs. Morgan," Harold corrected himself, the new name awkward on his tongue. "Mr. Morgan, I wanted to offer my congratulations." An uncomfortable silence descended until he spoke again, the words seemingly difficult for him. "And my apologies. To you both and to the town." He glanced around at the assembled faces, some still showing the lingering effects of the drought that had nearly torn the community apart. "The dam is gone, in case anyone wondered. Took it down myself last month." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the room at this unexpected announcement. Harold shifted Thomas to his other arm, the infant regarding me with curious blue eyes. "I also wanted you to know," he continued, addressing me directly, "that I've hired a proper nursemaid for Thomas, a widow from Cheyenne with excellent references. She's She's good with him. Kind. I'm glad, I said simply, recognizing the peace offering for what it was. The painful separation from Thomas had been among the hardest consequences of my decision to leave the Miller farm, though I knew it had been the right choice for all concerned. Harold nodded awkwardly. Well, we won't intrude on your celebration, just wanted to wish you both happiness. He hesitated, then added with evident effort, You deserve it. As he turned to go, I acted on impulse. Harold, I called softly. When he turned back, I gestured to Thomas. May I? Surprise flickered across his features before he carefully transferred the baby into my arms. Thomas studied me solemnly for a moment before breaking into a gummy smile of recognition that squeezed my heart. Hello, sweet boy, I whispered, brushing a kiss against his downy head. You've grown so much. I felt Caleb's presence beside me, solid and reassuring. To my surprise, he reached out and gently chucked Thomas under the chin, earning a delighted gurgle from the infant. Fine-looking boy you have there, Miller, he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. Something passed between the two men then. Not friendship, certainly, but perhaps the beginning of a truce, for the sake of a child who deserved to know peace rather than discord as his heritage. When I returned Thomas to his father's arms, Harold managed a small but genuine smile. If you'd be willing, Mrs. Morgan, perhaps Thomas might benefit from your teaching when he's of school age. I hear you'll be the finest teacher in the territory. I would be honored, I replied, recognizing both the request and the respect it represented. As Harold departed with Thomas, Caleb drew me close once more. You continue to amaze me, he murmured against my hair. Your capacity for forgiveness, for seeing goodness where others might not look. I leaned into his embrace, watching as the children darted between well-wishers toward the refreshment table Mrs. Wilson had laden with wedding treats. Life is too precious to waste on bitterness, I said simply, and too unpredictable to take for granted. Caleb's arms tightened around me. One thing you can take for granted, Mrs. Morgan, he promised, his voice husky with emotion. My love for you will endure through whatever unpredictable paths lie ahead. I turned in his embrace to face him fully, my husband in truth at last, as mine will for you. Like this ring you forged, I added, admiring the golden band that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the schoolhouse windows. Our love has been hammered strong through fire and pressure, and it will last forever, Caleb finished, lowering his mouth to mine once more. Around us, the schoolhouse hummed with celebration, children laughing, neighbors chatting, a community united in joy rather than divided by hardship. The path that had brought me to this moment had twisted in ways I could never have anticipated when I first boarded that stagecoach to Timber Creek. What had seemed at first a cruel twist of fate, Harold's betrayal, my desperate acceptance of a position beneath my station, had proven instead to be divine guidance, leading me not merely to employment or a marriage of convenience, but to authentic love and belonging. As Caleb led me toward our waiting friends and family, our children darting back to claim places beside us, I silently thanked Providence for the blacksmith's promise that would shape my days forevermore. A love as enduring as iron, as precious as gold, forged in adversity's flame, but destined to shine through all the seasons of our lives together.